Hi, I'm Mr. Miller, and in this video I'm going to teach you about best use of each graph type, give you some graphing tips in general, and talk about how to make bar graphs. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk about the best use for each graph type. If we're going to use bar graphs or double bar graphs, they're best used for comparing the size of categories to each other using numbers. If we're going to make circle graphs, they're best suited for comparing the size of categories to the whole using percents. Line graphs and double line graphs are best used for showing how data changes over time. And histograms are best used for showing the frequency distribution of some measured quantity. We're going to see examples of that as we go along. So, before we get into making some specific kinds of graphs, let's talk about some general tips for making graphs. So first of all, you want to make sure that you're making your graph big enough so that the information is clearly displayed. When I give students workspace, I expect that they're going to use most or all of that space. Now, if the space is an entire page, it's okay to just use half or a little bit less than half the page. But otherwise, if you're just given a small graphical area, a grid that doesn't occupy a lot of space, maybe a couple inches by a couple inches, you should try to use all of that space if at all possible. Second tip I have is make sure that each category or time increment is equal in size along the horizontal axis. The third thing is make sure the vertical axis starts at 0 and goes up to the maximum numerical value and is divided into equal increments. And the final graph making tip I have is make sure that both axes are labeled and you put a really specific, informative title at the top. Keep these tips in mind as we make our graphs, and let's get into the first example. So we're going to look at making bar graphs first, and here's some data that I collected from my Math 8 classes. It was how to get to school. Now, I asked students if they walk to school or they take the bus or they ride a skateboard or they take a bike or they get to school in some kind of a motor vehicle, and I gave them two options. Either they come with their parents or there's a student that's driving them in a motor vehicle. So here's the data that was collected from the 1-2 class. There were 11 people who walked. There was nobody who was taking the bus. There was only one person who was skateboarding. Nobody took bikes, but 13 people came in motor vehicles with a parent, and there were 2 people who were coming in student motor vehicles. Now, in my 1-3 block class, the numbers were a little bit different. So in this case, there were 6 people who walked to school, and the other 14 came in parent motor vehicles. And finally, I've got the 2-3 class. There were 16 people who walked. There were 9 people coming in parent motor vehicles, and that's it. So what we want to take a look at is, first of all, making a single bar graph from the data. And I'm going to use the data for the 1-2 class. And then I'm going to show you how to make a triple bar graph using all of this data. So let's get started with the single bar graph. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm setting up my vertical axis. I'm making sure that I'm starting at 0 and going to the maximum number. If you look back to the data that I had, the largest number I had was 16. So I'm going from 0 up to 16, and I'm going in equal increments. You'll also notice that I've labeled the vertical axis, the number of students. On the horizontal axis, I'm going to make sure that I've got equal spacing for all of these categories. And I also make sure that I've got a label for the horizontal axis. Another thing that's really important is to make sure that there's a really specific title at the top. Now, some people might just say, this is just ways of getting to school for a bunch of students. But that's not very specific. So I know it's a bit of a lengthy title, but take a look. It says how Mr. Miller's 1-2 Maths 8 students get to school. And this is at Walnut Grove Secondary School in the year 2019-2020. So it's really clear exactly what I'm representing. And now what I do is I make sure I do a bar for each one of these that goes to the right height. So walking, there were 11 people who walked. There was just one person who would ride a skateboard in. There were 13 people who came by parent motor vehicle. And there were 2 people who would come with a student motor vehicle. So notice that the bars are all equal in width, and notice that I only have one color because it's one set of data. Next, we're going to look at making a triple bar graph. So I'm going to skip through the first little bit. It's very similar to what we had before. I've reduced the amount of space across horizontally that I'm using for the graph because I'm going to have to add another element in here at the end, which is going to be the legend. It'll be legendary, just wait for it. Anyways, the title at the top is very similar, but instead of saying how Mr. Miller's 1-2 Maths 8 students get to school, I'm talking about all of my Maths 8 students. So now what I do is I make a bar for all 3 classes, how many people walk. So there are 11 people who walk to school from the 1-2 class. There are 6 people who walk to school from the 1-3 class, and there are 16 people who walk to school from the 2-3 class. And then I go over to my other categories and I fill in bars. So there's only one person who would ride a skateboard in from the 1-2 class, and none of the other classes have skateboarders. Now I go to the getting to school by parent motor vehicle, and I fill in the bars for all 3 of the classes. And finally I fill in the student motor vehicle category with the 2 people that get to school this way from the 1-2 class, and that's it. Now I've told you that the green is 1-2 and that the red is for 1-3 and blue is for 2-3, but of course I need to make sure that this is clear on paper here if I'm doing this by hand. So I need to add in a legend. So this is where, and notice that I'm using color now. I've got 3 different colors, and the reason that I've got 3 different colors is to indicate those 3 different sets of students. So that's how to make a bar graph. Now that's how you would make a bar graph if you're doing it by hand. Let's take a look at how you do that in Microsoft Excel. So here's a spreadsheet, a blank spreadsheet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, enter in the data that we had in the table. So I'm going to start typing in. Now, before I start typing in, because if I put in ways of getting to school, you notice that everything is kind of small. So you may want to zoom in on things. You can either pinch to zoom, or you can adjust the zoom level down here. And depending on whether you're on a Mac or a PC or looking at the online version of it, it may look a little bit different, but pretty much the same. So I'm going to fill in everything in here. So ways of getting to school, I've got walking, I've got bus and skateboard and bike and parent motor vehicle and then student motor vehicle. And now this looks a little bit sloppy because the letters are going outside of the cell A1 and into cell B1. And I'd like to have everything fitting inside this one cell. And likewise, here we've got things bleeding over a little bit. So it'd be nice if, now you can see as I hover between A and B that I can actually adjust how wide this should go. Now that's maybe too far and that's not far enough. Actually, if I just double click on that, it will size it exactly as wide as it needs to be to fit all of the text that's in here. So now I can go to the next column and start typing in the data. So this is the number of people in block 1, 2. And so now I'm going to put in my numbers. I've got 11 people walk, nobody takes the bus, there's 1 skateboarder, nobody rides a bike, there are 13 people who go by parent motor vehicle and 2 people who go by student motor vehicle. Now again, this is not fitting too well, so just double click and that all fits now. The other option that I have here, if I don't want it to go this wide, is I could take this and I can select to wrap the text. So for those of you that don't know, this would be wrap text right here. Oops, okay, so I've got wrap text, and if I back this up a little bit, let's try that again. Make that wrap text, wrap the text, there we go. So now it automatically adjusts the height so that it fits that way. So I think I may have tapped on something else here. Nope, actually everything looks okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a little bit of fiddling around with this table. I'm going to select all of this stuff here and I'm going to choose an option to have borders all the way around. Okay. Now there's some other fancy stuff that you can play around with, things like, you know, at the top, if you want the header to be a different color, you could certainly do that. You could put in a little bit of a gray fill in there and it just makes it stand out a little bit more. So you can play around with that if you want to. But what I want to show you now is how you take this table and you turn it into a bar graph. So what you do in Excel is you go Insert, and you can either go to Recommended Charts, and it'll give you some different options here. Or you can go to the one specifically that you're looking for. So it calls a vertical bar graph a column graph, and you can do that 3-dimensional if you want to. You can also do your bars horizontally, and they call this a bar graph and this a column graph. To me, they're both just bar graphs, just one is vertical and the other one is horizontal. But anyways, it's just the terminology that Excel uses. So I'm going to go with this one. I kind of like this vertical one. And you notice that some of the things I talked about as being important in making graphs is not totally factored in here. So, you know, I can certainly make this bigger just by enlarging this in a few different ways. Right? Maybe I'll just take the whole thing and slide it over so we can see our data at the same time. So I'm just going to have this stretch out a little bit further this way, and I'll have this stretch down. So now it's looking like it's taking up lots of space, so that's good. We want to make it big and clear. Another thing that we want to do is we want to add a chart element, and you can go to Axis Title and you can add a space where you can put in the title for the horizontal axis. So these are the ways of getting to school. All right, and then the other thing that I want to add in is a vertical title here. And so I'm just going to select all of this, and I'm going to call this number of students. And the title is not exactly what I'm looking for here, so I'm just going to change this up to how Mr. Miller's 1-2 Maths 8 students get to school. And this is at Walnut Grove Secondary School in 2019-2020 school year. Okay, great. So now it's got a lot of those key features that I'm looking for. And you notice that all the bars are the same color. They're all equal in width. There's a lot of little fiddling around that you can do with it if you want. You can change the colors. You can change how this vertical axis looks, so you can format this axis, and you can start to play around with them. You know, if you want it to go up by ones instead of twos, you could do that. I kind of like the way it looked before, so I'm just going to leave it like that. There's other things that you can do, like the line here is not really showing up, so if I just add a solid line, that should now show up here. So there we go. Oh, now the other thing that was kind of weird is I'm not sure why it made it blue. So what was I doing here? I wanted to format this axis. And I'm going to go back to here, and it was the line. Oh yeah, the color here is blue. I'm not sure why it's blue. I think black makes more sense for the axis, but hey, that's just me. And again here I can select into the horizontal axis and format this axis. And if I want, I can just add in a solid line, and it looks like that's already black, so that's looking good. Okay, so now this is looking like I would like it to be. So that would be a single bar graph. Now, if you're wondering the difference with a triple bar graph, it's not a whole lot different, but I'll give you a quick demo of that. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to delete it, and then I'm just going to add in a couple of more columns here. So let me just get back to my data. So I've got the number of people in block 1-3, and then the last one is the number of people in block 2-3, and then I'd probably want to select all these cells, get the borders there. Probably want to take whatever this width is here. Just take a look at the column width and try to make it this. Okay, so we'll go with 15 for width, and then I'll also make these two, just right clicking, column width, change that to 15 as well, just so that it's somewhat the same for these. And then I'm going to take these two and I am going to wrap that text, and now we've got some consistency, and then we just have to fill that in with the same color, and now it's looking good and professional. So now I just have to punch in my numbers. So I've got 6, 0, 0, 0, and then we've got 14 and 0, and then up we go to the last column. We've got 16 here, 0, 0, 0, and 9, and then one more 0. Okay, so now I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to insert a bar graph, and let's see how it does this. So this is pretty good. It's not too bad. I'd like it to be a little bit bigger. It's going to cover up some of my data, but that's okay. I think you can actually have this entire chart area as a separate tab. but or you can save it as a picture if you want. Move chart to a new sheet called chart 1. Let's see what that looks like. That's chart 1. So here's my data, and here's chart 1. So the nice thing here is that this is occupying the entire space here, so it's nice and big. I don't really like how this looks at the moment. So I'm going to just show you how you can play around with some of the layout features. There's actually some ways of getting kind of all the things that you're looking for in one. If you look at the quick layout, you say, okay, so what's got it the way I want it? So this has got a title at the top. It looks like it's got the numbers here and the names of the categories here, and it's got the legend off to the side, so that's pretty good. If you wanted the legend up at the top, you could do that. You know, I think I like this one because it looks like it's got a title at the top, both axes labeled, and it's got a legend off to the right, which is my preference. I'm not saying that it has to be that way, but so let's take a look at that. Cool, that looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to go into the chart title, and I don't need to format that, so I'm just going to click into that area. I'm going to select all, and I'm going to change the name to How Mr. Miller's Maths 8 Students Get to School, and this is at Walnut Grove Secondary School 2019-2020. All right, and then I can change this to number of students, and I can change this to ways of getting to school. All right, and now let's take a look at the legend here. So number of people in block 1, 2, number of people in block 1, 3, number of people in block 2, 3. Cool. Now you can do all kinds of other messing around with things, changing the colors if you want to see the colors, a different set of colors. Those ones are all kind of too similar. I might like to do something like this. It's got a little bit more contrast between them. How about this one? Oh yeah, that's a pretty nice contrast. I don't know, maybe I liked it in the first place. No, that's a nice one. Monochromatic? I don't think so. So I'm going to go with this one. You can do all kinds of other fiddling around with it. You can take this stuff and say, well, the text all looks kind of small here, so maybe you want to, I think if you double click on it, if you double click on it, it allows you to do the formatting. So text options, title options, let's see. It might take a little bit more playing around with this before you figure out exactly where you can change all of these things. Right, font, yeah, font. Okay, so maybe I want to go a little bit bigger. So like 14.1. How about we go to like 16? Okay, so if I go like that, okay, so now it just makes it a little bit bigger. So, you know, try playing around with some of these things. Again, most of the items in here, if you just right click into something, it'll give you the option to modify it. So like when I see vertical axis, if I right click on that, I can format that axis, and so now I can say I don't really need it to go up to 18, maybe I only want it to go up to 16. And so I can just make that change, right? If I want to have the major units be 1, I can do that. If I want to have Or maybe I want to have it as 2, but then have minor as 1. And maybe I want to show those minor units. So like tick marks. So it's not showing the minor type. So maybe I want to show that as well. So you notice that it just added in those tick marks. It's not actually putting the numbers there, but at least you can see those tick marks. So play around with those things, see what you like doing. For me, I kind of like to have that solid line there. And okay, so yeah, that's there now. And again, on the horizontal axis, so I would format this, and I kind of like this to be a solid line, and I prefer it to be black. Yeah, so how's that looking now? There we go. Not too bad. Anyways, I encourage you, you have access to Office 365 at home on your computers, on your tablets, whatever. Play around with it. Certainly works well in browser, but downloading Microsoft Excel onto your device will work a lot more smoothly. So check it out and see if you can make a single bar graph and a triple bar graph out of this data. Okay, so that's it. More to come later. Circle graphs are coming up next, so stay tuned. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.